Definitely. So we're going to get rolling here with our first speaker, Ashley Stokes. Ashley, I'm just pulling up your slides right here real quick.
Great.
And all right. So we've already introduced ourselves. And Ashley will be talking first about the past history of seals and whales in New England. So Ashley, take it away.
Sure. So I'll touch a little bit on the chronology of kind of where whaling began, how it began in New England. We're a little bit famous for, I like to think, in this area. And then I'll go into a little bit of sealing as well. So the bounties that were on seals back in the day. And then we'll move on to the protections that were put in place to help some of these species rebound. And we'll talk a little bit about, what's worked and moving forward, things that we can look for. So Brian, if you want to advance. So hopefully you guys can see all of that okay. So again, just to reiterate for Brian, if you guys can keep on speaker view so that my screen will be your primary screen up there as opposed to tiled view, I'll be very, very small. So commercial whaling actually began back in the 17th century. And the industry, when it started in the States, though Massachusetts was not the first state to have whaling, it did also start pretty simultaneously down in Long Island as well. But it started here, believe it or not, in Buzzards Bay, so down on the Cape, but it was also already flourishing around the world. So it wasn't a new thing. It's not like we started it here in this area. But back in the mid 1500s, early 1600s, there's a lot of literature out there about early settlers, talking about the biodiversity and abundance of these whale species and what they might be able to be used for. Native Americans actually didn't actively hunt whales at sea until European settlers. And they started hunting whales first near shore. The technology and the gear just wasn't quite good enough yet to be going too far offshore in the deeper waters. But organized whaling efforts began in our colonies down in the Wellesley area. So again, we're talking about kind of the Massachusetts hub in 1644. So if you think about that, and how far we've come since then, it's pretty amazing to think that but little Massachusetts was a huge part of all of that getting started up. But in the 1700s, there was the decline of whales off Cape Cod and Nantucket. So they did have to begin pursuing whales further offshore. But of course, doing it further inshore, or closer to shore rather, was a lot easier for them initially. Again, they didn't have the gear to be processing these whales out at sea. Believe it or not, once these whales were hunted, so if you can imagine this, they have a decent sized ship that they're on. But unfortunately, unless you are the captain of the ship, unless you are a cook of the ship, a carpenter, or actually one of the harpooners, the rest of the crew on the ship was down in the holds, down towards the front of the ship. And the living conditions that are explained in a lot of this literature was far less than ideal. They didn't have great food out there. They had a lot of rats on board. They had cockroaches on board. And they didn't have sleeping cabins like the higher ups did on the ship. But then when it came time to go out whaling, they had a small boat that they had aside of their ship, which they just basically describe as canoes, big canoes. And they would take these crews out. The crews were about 15 to 20 men on average, and the average age was 15 years old. And these were adolescents that were hoping to become captains in future years. So you can imagine that it must have been pretty chaotic, but then to get into a small boat, thankfully they weren't going too far offshore yet. They would head out in the small boat. They would use a harpoon to harpoon the whale, and then the harpoon would be attached either to a wooden floating barrel, or it would be attached directly to their small boat. And then they would basically, either the whale would tow the barrel around, or tow around the small boat until it eventually tired out, wasn't trying to dive as much, wasn't swimming as actively, and then could be further killed and then dragged to shore. But they had a kind of an interesting name. So we talk about Massachusetts a lot when we talk about this hub of whaling, and they called it the Nantucket sleigh ride when they would have the whale attached to their small boat and being pulled around until the whale eventually tired. So then the whale would be pulled to shore and processed on land. And originally, they were aiming at sperm whales. And the reason for that is that sperm whale oil has been found to burn the best. So of course, all whale oil could be used, but they did find that sperm whale oil, which is stored in the front of the head with the spermaceti organ, had burned the best. So they were originally targeted. But you can imagine these whales are not small whales. They're toothed whales as well. So they wanted to find other uses for different parts of this animal. So most of the things that were made around that time, and again, we're talking back at the 1700s, the oil was the primary use. It was used not only to lubricate a lot of different machines, it was also used for lighting and candle making. So of course, we're talking days prior to modern electricity. And then once you get down into the teeth and bones, so of course we have two different kinds of whales. We have not only the toothed whales, or sperm whales in this case, but we also have baleen whales, whales that filter feed. They have the baleen plates in their mouth. So a lot of these things were used, the toothed whales, they were used for artistic products. So when they weren't whaling, a lot of these crew members, when they were on board, had a lot of time to kill. So they would, both onshore and on the boat, they were trying to find uses for it, and later would become known as scrimshaw, modern day. So they would carve these little artistic products, whether it be, a figurine or something along those lines. And then the baleen, so the whales that are not toothed whales, the baleen was actually used for hoop skirts, corsets, early furniture springs, umbrella ribs. They had a lot of different uses for that. And then another thing that they found a big use for was ambergris. So ambergris is a substance that's formed inside the intestines of whales, and it actually helps them to pass squid beaks once they have eaten squid. It was used as a fixative in perfumes. And imagine this, so something coming out of the intestines of a whale, it would sometimes be excreted rather into the water, and some people would be found walking the beaches to try and find this excrement because the ambergris was actually as valuable as gold. So back then, an eighth of a pound would be worth about $10,000. So just imagine that for a minute, walking along the shore to try to find that. So very, very valuable. But then as we move forward a little bit in 1774, which was 2 years before the American Revolution, the whaling fleet kind of topped out. It was at about 300, and there's a little bit of discrepancy here, 350 to 360 vessels is what we have found from 15 different ports. And that's around the time that New Bedford started to become known as a valuable whaling port. So as we move forward a little bit into kind of the rise and fall of this colonial whaling industry, I mentioned that sperm whales were the primary target. But aside from that, right whales were also targeted as well. They were more buoyant when they were killed, so they were a lot easier to track and a lot easier to tow back to shore. But they were also, in a lot of these different literatures, you hear them talking about, as they are scanning the shore, and they had all of the men involved with this. Men would take turns in towers along the shore and scan the shore day and night for any whale activity. But when they would see right whales, they would point out to them and say, that's the right whale to hunt, and they would go after that whale. So those were the two primary targets, but they did also hunt other whale species as well. But all whaling came to a stop during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, and didn't continue until after the War of 1812 was over. And then as we move forward a little bit in time, during the 40s and 50s is really when New Bedford really started to rise. And then by the 1900s, New Bedford was known as one of the wealthiest whaling ports. So that's pretty exciting for us, especially those of you that live around here, to have that history in your back pocket. It was such an interesting time, in my opinion. But then as we get into the 1860s, whaling was slowly declining. There wasn't as much of a market for it. And the Norwegians actually came out with the newer techniques to process whales directly on the ship. So they weren't limited. They had a lot better technology to do it. And then by 1963, the demand was pretty much non-existent in this area and whaling ceased to exist. But the United States didn't stop there. We were actually the ones to start whale watching later on. And then you can see in that graph, it just gives you a rough idea of what the whaling output looked like for average millions that were brought in. And you can see not only, the rise and fall of it, but that bulk of time that we were talking about, that really, it became a very exciting time for us, specifically in New England, though it was happening worldwide anyway. So if we shift gears a little bit to what I love, the seals, there was, believe it or not, we hear a lot about the bounties that were put on seals. So back in archaeological evidence indicates that Native Americans have been sealing for a long time. But if you look back into a lot of the Native American literature, there were a lot of times where the Native Americans would be seen saying that there were so many seals around that they could basically step on their backs and never have to touch land or the edge of the water. So they could take as many as they could, they say in these literature, and it didn't really have an impact. So as we moved into the 19th and 20th century, seals were seen as a problem, and there were bounties put on them. So depending on the state, the bounties varied. There isn't a lot of data. It seems to be a missing gap in New Hampshire, believe it or not, where the Seacoast Science Center is located. But I did find quite a bit of literature both on Maine and Massachusetts. So for a lot of you that are local, there were 2 spans of years, both in Maine and Massachusetts. In Maine, there was 2 spans that total about 24 years, in which just shy of 25,000 bounties were recorded. And again, there is a lot of inaccurate and missing data. And along with that also came the criminals. There were fraudulent claims as well. People claiming animals multiple times in multiple states. So they tried to get a little bit more savvy in how they recorded these animals. And in Massachusetts, there was a span of 55 years over those 2 time blocks, just shy of 16,000 bounties. So just to give you an idea of how much these people were making, in Maine, it was far less. In 1891, Maine actually categorized the bounties using a nose. So all you had to do was bring in the nose of a seal to prove that you killed that animal, and you were paid your bounty. So in 1891, it was 50 cents a nose. And by 1895, they reached $1 a nose. But just to compare for you guys, in Massachusetts, they actually went by the tail. And then later on in the 1900s, they went to skin and nose. So you had to provide a small piece of skin and also the nose because they were having a lot of issues with fraudulent claims in Massachusetts. So in 1888, so right around the time that Maine was getting 50 cents a nose, Massachusetts was getting $1 a tail. And then in 1892, they went to $3 a tail. And then they made the shift to skin and nose when they were having all of the fraudulent claims in the early 1900s. 1919, they got $2 for a skin and nose combination. And then in 1933, it actually rose to $5 per seal. So that, of course, not a shock, resulted in regional extirpation of a lot of species. And so they realized that some sort of protections had to be put in place. So along came the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which we'll talk about. And in the year following the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they did a survey up in Maine, and they started seeing in small numbers these animals coming back. Harbor seals in the low thousands and gray seals 30. So it was a very, very slow increase, but has been obviously increasing since then. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act, I'm sure most of you know this already, but it was enacted by Congress in October of 1972, and it does prohibit, with some exceptions, the take and importation of marine mammals in the U.S. waters and by U.S. citizens on the high seas. There were some amendments to the MMPA in 1992, which actually formalized the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program, which is what all of our response organizations are a part of. And the designated office to oversee that work was the NOAA Office of Protected Resources, who now serves as the lead agency. So that's what we all fall under that do this work. And the MMHSRP focuses on stranding and entanglement networks, which Kathy will talk a little bit about, unusual mortality event responses, biosurveillance and baseline health research, which also Wendy will talk a little bit about, and of course the John H. Prescott grant program, which supports a lot of the work that we do. It's a competitive grant annually that we can all apply for. And luckily, since the MMPA has been enacted back in 1972, 66% of marine mammals with known trends have been shown to be increasing. Of course, some of them more dramatically than others, but it's a testament to the work that has been done to protect these animals. So just to show you a quick graph, I know I'm short on time here, and it's important to note that this data in this graph is just for Seacoast Science Center Marine Mammal Response. So that's just for New Hampshire and the northern part of Massachusetts from Essex northward. But it just gives you guys a rough idea of the seasonality of our work. So of course, you'll notice, not surprisingly, that our highest months on an average year are between June and September. Now, the reason for that is twofold. One, that's also when the public is out on a lot of these rocky outcroppings, rocky shores, and sandy beaches. We rely on the public to call in any live or dead marine mammal on shore so that we know about it and can get a trained responder out there. But not only that, it also corresponds with our pupping seasons. So gray seals are born towards the tail end, beginning of the year in winter. They're with mom for 3 weeks and then are 3 to 4 weeks and then are completely independent. And then after that follows the harbor seals. So typically they're born May and June. They're also a species that is with mom for 3 to 4 weeks and then is completely independent as well. Pupping season seems to have been starting a little bit earlier the last couple years in April. And so because of that, if you imagine an animal being born, say middle of May, they're with mom until about early to middle of June, and then they're completely independent. But being young animals, it does take them some time to learn to forage on their own, learn the spots that are good and not so great to haul out on. And unfortunately, those young animals often will choose these low-lying beaches and easy to access rocky shores that also the people frequent because it's a lot easier for them to haul out there. So it's not to say that seals that are hauled out need intervention. It's completely normal for them to haul out on shore. But that's why we do have responders in place to determine, if the animal is healthy or not, if it's deceased, but still of scientific value, we can get it into a lab setting and do a post-mortem exam on it and further testing and biosurveillance, and just to keep an eye on the species as a whole and to protect them from the public and vice versa. So you'll hear about some of those viruses that can be transferred between the two. So we want to make sure that people are not only respecting the Marine Mammal Protection Act to keep a safe distance away from these animals, but also to protect themselves as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Kathy at National Marine Life Center to talk a little bit more about, what happens with these animals when they need to go into rehabilitation.
Awesome. Good stuff, Ashley. So Kathy, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit here, and I'll get your slides all set up.
Yes, well, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Brian. And thank you everyone for tuning in to this topic tonight. It's really fun to be talking to such a great group of people. Again, my name is Kathy Zagzebski. I'm the President and Executive Director of the National Marine Life Center, a nonprofit marine animal hospital and science and education center in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts. And I've been working in the stranding network in various capacities for 26 years. So the next slide is just intended as an introduction to the National Marine Life Center. And I do want to point out that with one exception, all the seals that are pictured here are animals that were rescued by our friends at the Seacoast Science Center and rehabilitated at the National Marine Life Center, and all of them were released. So the National Marine Life Center, back one please, Brian. We have a threefold mission: wildlife rehabilitation, and we rehabilitate. So we are not involved in rescue, in the stranding response or the beach response. We rely on partners like Seacoast Science Center to provide that important response and to help get the animals to our marine animal hospital. We rehabilitate both seals and sea turtles right now. We have permits from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in order to do that work. And we rehabilitate on average about 120 animals per year. That also includes turtles. Our science program focuses on the concept of One Health to learn more about why the animals strand and what that's telling us about the bigger picture. And our education program focuses on taking these stories and these lessons learned from the animals and reaching out to people through education in order to foster conservation. And we reach about 9,800 people every year in our education programs. And we have 160 volunteers that help us with this work. And to date, we have rehabilitated or cared for 211 seals and counting. Next. So I want to really pick up where Ashley left off with the little bit of review about the marine mammal protection, or about the Marine Mammal Stranding Network. As she mentioned, it was established in the 1992 amendments to the 1972 Marine Mammal Protection Act. And stranding as a response to animals on the beach basically started pretty organically in the 1970s. The two oldest stranding response organizations came out of the New England Aquarium in Boston, and also the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito, California. So under the MMPA and the Marine Mammal Stranding Network, the lead agency is NOAA Fisheries Office of Protected Resources, and this really represents a public and private partnership between the federal government and nonprofit organizations. And the next slide goes into the 4 elements of the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program, include those stranding and disentanglement networks, I should say. And there's a strong science purpose to this. We help the individual animal through our work with rescue, rehabilitation, and release. And we also report that to the National Stranding Database in order to help determine trends and also look at baseline normals. So a lot of the data, a lot of the information on the current history of marine mammals actually comes from stranding networks, versus the early information on the history of marine mammals came from whaling data. The second component of the stranding response program is responding to unusual mortality events, and that is defined as a stranding that is unexpected or involves a significant number of animals, any marine mammal populations, and demands an unusual response. The third element is biosurveillance, and we're going to be talking more about this later, and it also includes a national tissue bank to bank samples, and then of course the Prescott Grant Program. And I would like to thank NOAA, and the availability of this program has really dramatically impacted the ability of stranding networks to both respond to animals and to collect the important data about and from those animals. And we've been a beneficiary of that. The Prescott program since 2001 has provided over $60.2 million to stranding networks through 696 grants. And an important element of these grants, it doesn't come anywhere near funding our whole operation, and it isn't a competitive grant, but it also represents that best partnership between us and our public supporters, because all grants require matching funds. So they basically require both that investment from private donors. So your contributions tonight towards our rehabilitation and rescue programs is really an important component of that. On the next slide, you can actually see that there are several regions of response. So the network is made up of nonprofit organizations like us and like Seacoast Science Center, academic institutions such as Tufts University, and government organizations. And there are a variety of regions throughout the United States that are divided into response groups, and we are basically governed by in the New England Mid-Atlantic region, or it's currently called the Greater Atlantic region. So we report to a federal stranding coordinator in Gloucester, Massachusetts. So the next slide is going into now a little bit more about why animals strand. And again, this stranding response represents that transition of people from a consumptive use of marine animals in the form of whaling and sealing to more of a conservation response, to recognizing that these populations have been impacted, often dramatically, by human activity, and kind of an appreciation of the animals and their role in the environment, and a desire for people to help. So we started responding to stranded animals, and along the way, we've learned a number of lessons. Every stranding is different. There are some pretty unusual strandings that we see here in this region, in particular on the Cape, with mass strandings, but also a number of single strandings of many different marine mammal species. And there are differences between natural and human influence causes, and compounding the wonderful puzzle that is every stranding case is often there are combinations of these causes. So on the next slide, just wanted to mention this specific case of mass strandings. And mass strandings, really, they've been happening for hundreds of years here on Cape Cod. And in the early days, even before commercial whaling in our region, this was actually seen as an unexpected bounty. Both Native Americans and early colonists would see, for example, pilot whales, as in this picture, on the beach, and they would harvest the animals for the same reasons that we were whaling, for oil, for meat, blubber, and all the different uses of the whales. And it wasn't until the 70s, again, that people started actually responding to mass strandings to try to help. And ever since, people have been trying to understand why mass strandings occur. There are lots of theories why a mass stranding is when you get two or more unrelated animals that strand at approximately the same time, approximately the same place, and often you get dozens of animals, like in this pilot whale stranding. There are some thoughts that the animals are moving, following prey inland. Maybe there are magnetic anomalies, sun flares, moon flares. But what we've noticed is over the years, there are basically factors in mass stranding that have to do with the biology and the natural history of the animals themselves, as well as the geography of the local area where they mass strand. So on the natural history side, the species that mass strand are those animals that are very tightly bonded. So there is an element of follow the leader. There are also animals that are usually more pelagic, or they live in the open ocean. And so they don't really understand what a tide is. Regardless of why they come close to shore, then when the tide goes out, they get stuck. And then that leads us to the geography. Mass strandings happen where there's a broad tidal flat, strong and unusual currents, or an extreme tidal flow, such as Cape Cod, but also places in Australia and New Zealand. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about why There are lots of different reasons for animals to strand as an individual, and this is probably most often the case that we see outside those dolphin and whale mass strandings on the Cape. Disease is probably the #1 reason why animals will strand as an individual, but they can also have parasites, variety of injuries, either from conspecifics, from others of the same species, or from predators such as sharks, or even from the environment. Geographical reasons, storms, they may be seeking food. Some are malnourished or separated from their moms. Very few animals actually die or strand because of old age. It's a very rough environment out there. And of course, on the next slide, there are a lot of reasons why that a lot of human activity that influences these strandings. Everything from simply harassing animals on the beach, and harbor seals like Bellatrix were actually approached by people on the beach. She may have just been waiting for her mom to return from a fishing trip. And unfortunately, people see a pup on the beach and they approach it and try to interact with it, sometimes with the best of intentions, thinking it's been abandoned, other times selfishly just to take a selfie. And that activity can actually lead to stranding. So we do ask and hope and recommend that you do stay 150 feet away from any marine mammal on the beach. There are also issues with entanglement of marine debris, increasingly issues of ingestion of marine debris, and plastic in our oceans is probably the #1, well, one of 2 big reasons why animals are impacted now in the environment. To an animal, a piece of plastic can look like food. We did a necropsy of a seal a couple of years ago that had a Twizzlers wrapper in its found in its digestive tract. So that wasn't the cause of the animal's death. And a necropsy is like an animal autopsy. It's when an animal doesn't make it, we do a dissection to try to figure out why it died. And so this animal had a Twizzlers wrapper. It wasn't fishing line. It wasn't, plastic bags. It was something that, I don't know about you, but we all enjoy. And if we don't dispose of that properly, we're all responsible for keeping the environment clean. Other elements are entanglement in both fishing gear and other marine debris. Ship strikes are a major factor. Pollution, gunshot injury, oil spills, and toxins. And it's not listed on here, but I do want to mention climate change. And there are increasing impacts seen, especially in animals like our ice seals. The previous, or 2 slides ago, there was a harp seal, mandrake, and harp seals and hooded seals are very much impacted by the melting of the polar ice caps. So once an animal is rescued by Seacoast Science Center or one of our other rescue partners, then the process for rehabilitating that animal is pretty lengthy and pretty involved. It can take anywhere from 6 weeks to sometimes 6 months to fully rehabilitate an animal so it can be released back out to the wild. When it first comes in, we have to do an admit exam, and that includes complete measurements and weights. We have to do diagnostic tests, for example, blood work and radiographs. Our veterinarian will come up with a treatment plan, and then our animal care staff and volunteers implement that treatment plan. There's a lot of charting and data recording. We want to note everything from the amounts that the animal actually ate, to the results of the latest blood test, to how it was behaving or how it was interacting, or if it was interacting with other seals in the same enclosure, because all of that provides important information for determining the animal's health and progress. Every day we feed the animals, we give them medication either in the food or through other mechanisms, and we provide that daily husbandry care. And as those of you who have been involved know, that involves a lot of cleaning. Sometimes we need advanced diagnostics such as MRI scans or CT scans. And I would like to extend a shout out to Tufts University. They have an excellent Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, and they've been very gracious in the past by allowing us to bring animals, usually sea turtles, but bring animals to them for some of those diagnostics, because we of course don't have a CT machine here on site. Throughout the process, the animal is hopefully recovering, gaining weight. It's being monitored regularly by the veterinary staff and the animal care staff through continued diagnostics. And eventually the veterinarian will, the animal care staff will approve or recommend an animal for release, and the veterinarian will look at the medical records and approve it. There's another level of approval. We have to send that recommendation to NOAA Fisheries so that they can either agree or come back to us with questions, and then we organize a release of that animal. So I've talked a lot, or a little bit, about rehabilitation, but there are a lot of different reasons why it's important to rehabilitate. Many of the seals are not animals that are endangered here in Massachusetts, but there's a lot that we can learn about the science of what's happening in the environment through the rehabilitation program. And I mentioned on the next slide the idea of One Health, where animal health, environmental health, and human health are interconnected. And so on the next slide, you can see a story of that with our research into otitis media, which is an ear infection that we see in seals. And it's an area of science that our veterinarian is very involved with. These seals are coming in or expressing an ear infection of their middle ear. And is there something in the environment that's causing that infection in seals? And could that pose a risk to people as well? So another element of this idea of One Health comes with unusual mortality events. And I know that Wendy's going to be talking about this quite a bit. So I'm just going to introduce that the last couple of years, we in the New England have been responding to an increased die-off of harbor seals and gray seals. We seem to be coming to a close of that event, but between 2018 and especially 2018, 2019, there were a total of over 3,000 animals, and most of them were here between Maine and Massachusetts. So continuing on to the next slide, I just wanted to extend my own thank you, and we can close out my section, and I'd like to turn it over to Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. That was a great presentation about the rehab side of things and how we're collecting data to better understand these animals and the threats that they face moving forward in history, right? What the future is looking like. So Wendy, I'd like to introduce you, Dr. Wendy Puyear from Tufts University. Can you hear me, Wendy?
I can. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yeah, we're all good.
Excellent.
Sweet.
All right, so we've had a great overview from both Ashley and Kathy about kind of the big picture, long view of things that have posed a threat for marine mammals. And they both touched upon infectious disease being certainly a factor, but I think maybe prior to tonight, a lot of us intuitively recognize the idea that ship strikes and entanglements and ocean pollution are all things that can pose a definite risk for these animals. And perhaps we weren't all quite as aware of the fact that they do suffer from infectious disease in much the same way that we do. And in fact, respiratory diseases are one of the major things that end up leading to these mortality events that we've been discussing a little bit so far tonight. And if go to the next slide, this is actually a picture of a seal colony on Nantucket. And you will see that seal social distancing has not really caught on yet. And I think something that we are all very intimately aware of now is that if you have a high density of individuals and they're in very close proximity, viruses are really, really effective at spreading. So if we go to the next slide, kind of bringing home the point that seals also catch viruses. And again, those respiratory viruses are many of the ones that end up causing a lot of problems. And two of the major ones actually fall into these categories that we're showing here in these cartoons of influenza, which we're probably all pretty intimately familiar with as well, the flu. And there are several different versions of the flu, but the same versions can infect seals that infect us. And then morbillivirus is the other virus that ends up causing a lot of these mortality events. And morbillivirus is the version that infects seals. It's all part of the same family. That measles is similar in us, but in seals, it's a respiratory disease and it ends up impacting the central nervous system as well. So we have known about these mortality events having a viral cause going back 40-ish years or so to the late 70s. There are certainly other reasons why you can have mortality events, but generally speaking, if it is a viral mortality event, then it tends, or infectious disease, it tends to be viral. And for some reason, there is something special about our neck of the woods here in the North Atlantic. Kind of on the left of the screen, this is kind of an odd perspective of the globe from what we're used to seeing, but we've got North America over here on the left. And we end up seeing that there are these mortality events that happen on both sides of the Atlantic, the Western and the Eastern, and it's kind of pinged back and forth over the years, and it's pinged back and forth between influenza and morbillivirus. So when these kind of events happen in marine mammals, you can have a situation where as many as 50% of the population can die. So one of the events that happened with morbillivirus in the late 80s actually killed over 20,000 of the seals during a very short time period. And what ends up ultimately setting off these mortality events really all comes back to this idea of viruses spilling over. And again, this is something that is very, very relevant right now as we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic, is the idea of a virus moving from one animal to another. And it's just the fact that the world is full of viruses, and it generally is the case that a virus will evolve to be within a host, and they learn to coexist together just fine. And that is called a reservoir host. And that host doesn't necessarily get sick or have any major effects from that virus. But if you end up in a situation with there's a situation where the virus then moves from that host into a new host, then that's when it explodes and you have these huge pandemics or mortality events that occur. And ones that have been recent, obviously COVID-19, but then also swine flu and bird flu have also spilled over into the human population in the recent past. So how does a virus spill over? How does it move from one host to another? And in the case of influenza, as my cat needs to make a cameo always, in the case of influenza, there are actually a lot of forms of the virus that circulate out in the wild, primarily in wild birds. And because that's a reservoir host, it exists in that population just fine. And in a bird, even though it's respiratory in us, influenza, it's actually a gastrointestinal infection for birds. And that means that it's spread fecal-oral. And that is as lovely as it sounds. So a virus comes out fecally, and it is either ingested or inhaled from the next host, and then it infects through that manner. And birds are great at shedding the virus into the water, also onto the sand and onto the rocks. This nice frosted cake looking rock up there is all bird excrement, which may or may not have virus in it. And then you get various, whether it's a sea lion or a seal, falling out in that excrement. So on to the next slide. So there are lots of opportunities for birds to pass virus onto seals. And they, particularly with seabirds, they occupy the same habitat. They're along the same coast. They're physically in the same space. And then we also see that there can be these little pockets of little freshwater ponds that are close enough to the shore that the seals will come into that area. And it's certainly an area that birds will visit on a regular basis as well. So if virus is shed into that body of water, it can survive there for a period of time and then be ingested or inhaled by the seal coming through. And then we also see lots of examples of seals feeding on carcasses birds feeding on carcasses of seals. And then we've even seen where we're out on the rookery, on the pupping rookeries, and we've come across a pup rolling around quite happily in the carcass of a bird that it had come across. So there's lots of chances to mix viruses in both directions. So we know that there are these mortality events that happen, this spillover that has occurred periodically. But we've also learned over the last several years that there is virus, at least influenza, that is circulating just year to year within the gray seal population off of the coast of New England. And the data that is being shown here is from the pupping grounds, the rookeries off of New England. And what I'm showing you is how many of the pups we detect virus in, so how prevalent the virus is in that population. And it varies from year to year, but overall we see about 10% of those animals do have the influenza virus. So what's been interesting to know is that over the last couple of years, we're starting to see it expand into more species than we had initially seen in this region. So it had been that we were only seeing influenza in the gray seal pups. And over the last couple of years, we're seeing that not only is it in the gray seal pups, but some of the animals that are coming into the rehab facilities, both the harbor seals and the harp seals, are also starting to show that they're having influenza infections as well. So speaking of harp seals, that brings us to the other virus that has caused several mortality events in seals in this region. And it's a really interesting example. The first time that we became aware of this morbillivirus in these populations was in 1988. And as it turned out, so what you're seeing here, again, you're looking at the North Atlantic and kind of looking down toward the top of the globe. And the shaded areas, the yellow and the red, that is the harp seal population, their habitat, where you typically find harp seals. And then harbor seals tend to be lower down. They don't go as far up into the Arctic. And you'll get a high density of harbor seals that are in the North Sea, where I'm showing you the arrow down off of the bottom. And in 1988, just prior, there was a big collapse of the fish that the harp seals eat. And they came down in mass, tens of thousands of them all came down at once and came down and moved into the North Sea where the harbor seals were. So now you've got these two populations that haven't very frequently come into contact with each other, and now they're coming into very regular contact with each other. And as it turns out, the harp seals had been harboring this form of a virus, this morbillivirus, that was just fine for them. They had adapted to it, but they brought it down to a harbor seal that hadn't seen it before, and a couple of months later, 20,000 harbor seals are dead. So that's another example of how species come into contact with each other that hadn't before can lead to these massive events. So of course, on everybody's mind, and something that comes up a lot is, could seals end up having coronavirus? And the fact of the matter is, there is currently no evidence that seals have been infected by coronavirus, the current SARS-CoV-2. But if you look at the biology of the way that the virus works, and you look at the biology that the seals have available for what the virus needs to be able to attach and infect and function, it is possible. It is theoretically possible that they could be infected. And the bigger concern that myself and others have had going forward is not so much that it is circulating out there in seals right now, but that transmission goes both ways. It's not just about animals infecting us. We can also infect other animals. And we've started to see a smattering of a few cases like that. So there have been cases in the Bronx Zoo where some large cats, tigers and various other large cats, have been shown to contract COVID-19 from humans. There have been a handful of dogs that have been shown to get it from humans, and a handful of cats, domestic cats, that have been shown to get it from humans. So it is possible that we could pass it on to them. So that is something that we definitely need to be paying close attention to, transmission in both directions. So then the final point that I want to make is that we are in a period of time where the planet is rapidly changing. And that is changing animal behavior in a number of different ways. So what you're seeing here is that the darker colors that are shown on this map are anomalies in sea surface temperature. And we happen to be in a region in the world where the ocean water off of the Gulf of Maine is heating up faster than really any other place on the planet. So the water temperature is changing very rapidly here. And that has a huge cascade all the way from impacting directly the animals that are right there. So that impacts their immune health, that impacts how seals can thermoregulate, that impacts how they have to use their habitat to adjust for that. But it also impacts the distribution of animals. As the water becomes warmer, a lot of fish that the seals perhaps was their preference for their diet, those seals are moving further north into colder waters. Meanwhile, you have animals that typically were further south that are coming up now that the water is getting warmer here. And that is part of the reason why we are seeing this big increase in great white sharks. There are several reasons, but one of them is that our water temperature is increasing. And there have been manatees that have been reported up here in recent past. And then you also have animals like the ice seals that are coming down more frequently because their food supplies are being depleted. So they're coming down looking for a replacement for their habitat and their food supplies. You have animals coming down from the Arctic, you have animals coming up from more southern regions. You have a lot of stressors that are happening in the environment here locally, and you have all of this stuff that is brewing together that really gives a lot of opportunities for infectious disease to cross between species. And then just to paint the picture a little bit bleaker, not only do we have this change going from north to south, but in recent years, we have seen this very rapid decline in sea ice in the Arctic. And what that does is it is effectively opening up the channels around the top of the globe. So it's making it now possible for animals to more readily circumnavigate around the globe, whereas perhaps they didn't have access to some of those regions before. So now you've got the possibility where animals are changing their distribution up and down, and then also being able to move around. So lots and lots of opportunities for viruses and other infectious agents to be able to spread back and forth between various populations. So I don't want to end us too much here on gloom and doom, but really just want to be pointing out that it matters. It all matters. The way that we treat this planet and the way that we treat the other habitants on this planet, it matters. And that we are all connected. So none of us live in little bubbles, not birds, not seals, not people. And that the health of one individual species really does impact the health of all of us. And that is where I'm going to end for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy. That was an incredible note to end on. I think you made some really interesting points there. And I mean, I know I have a couple questions for you just off the top of my head. But I want to open up now to our live Q&A session. So if anyone who's listening has any questions for any of the three speakers who've just gone, Ashley, Kathy, or Wendy, feel free to shoot us a message in the chat. I know personally, I'd like to start off just pointing out with one of the things that you mentioned, Wendy, is how exactly do you research these diseases in seal populations right now? I know I had the pleasure of going out there with you to Monomoy Island and off the Cape, where you were doing some research on gray seals, but what's exactly the data that you're collecting when you go out and sample these animals?
So excellent question, Brian. And there's several different directions I could answer that from. But to say that there are really two major components to how we're trying to monitor the health of the animals and try to get an idea of what is circulating for disease, as well as the health of the animals themselves. So immune function and genetics that are impacting how well they can respond to a threat that's coming in. So all of these questions we do in two different manners. Actually going out into the rookeries, out to the place where the pups are being born, and to the what we expect are healthy populations, but then also the rehab facilities are instrumental in also being able to understand what's happening with the populations. So working with those two avenues is really critical to how we do this work. And when we go out to the field, there's a team of people that go out into the field in the middle of the winter, because that's when pups are born. And we focus on pups because pups are 50 to 100 pounds instead of the adults that are 600 to 800 pounds. So they're a little more accessible to be able to do our studies on. And they are, they're not harmed in any way. They are from the time, so we capture the pups, and best case scenario, from the time we first capture a pup to the time we release it and it's on its way, can be as fast as 6 minutes. Usually it ends up being about 12 minutes or so. And it's just like people getting tested for COVID-19. They're getting a nasal swab and various other swabs. And we do take a blood sample, and the animal is tagged so that we can have any information back on that animal's movement if they've seen in other places at other times.
Awesome. Thanks. I think that's a great explanation of it all. So I have another question coming in here from Cameron. How can you get a license for marine mammal rehab and rescue? Kathy or Ashley, if one of you two wants to touch on that.
Sure. So there is a permitting process. Generally, it's organizations that will apply for the permit. You can imagine, sounds great in the forefront of, oh, I'll just apply for a permit and do this work. But I will say now, having been both on the field side of it as well as the operational and budgeting side of it, they're very expensive programs to run. It takes a lot to do it and to do it well. That's not to say it couldn't be cobbled together, but it does take a while not only to plan for the program, but also go through the permitting process, which is directly through NOAA Fisheries. So they hold all of our permits. And basically what happens is when an organization wants to get involved with this work is they submit the application process, which is a very lengthy and very paperwork heavy task, but not to say it can't be done. But then once you get a permit or are granted a permit or stranding agreement, as it's called, through NOAA Fisheries, you're put on basically a probationary status, typically for a year, where you have to report to them more often than when you're a seasoned veteran organization. And then once you get through your probationary year, you can apply for multi-year, typically 3-year permits. So we're just coming up on, actually this year, on the end of one of our 3-year permitting processes. So we'll have to go through the re-permitting process again. So again, it's not very easy, and it is labor intensive, and the programs are very expensive to run. But all of us that do this work are very passionate about it. So it's worth it in the long run.
Nice. Great answer.
And I guess I'd like to add that a really easy way for you to get involved is to volunteer. We're doing the permitting already, but if you live anywhere in the rescue range of Seacoast Science Center, or within an hour or two of National Marine Life Center, or any one of the other organizations involved in marine mammal stranding response, it's a great opportunity to volunteer and get involved and let somebody else do the permitting and help with the fun stuff.
Yeah, and all of our organizations, we quite frankly can't do this work without volunteers. It helps us keep costs down and helps us get big tasks done that a small staff just can't get done.
Nice. As you usually say, Ashley, it takes a village.
It does.
So I have another question coming in here for Dr. Puyear. Are there similar trends of viral spread being observed on the West Coast? Or is the impact of climate change on the West Coast seal species somewhat mitigated by the fact that the Pacific is, on average, deeper and colder?
That is an excellent question and a very insightful question. And there really has not been much for viral infections that occur on the West Coast. The bigger thing that has been an issue on that side as far as mortality events have been the harmful algal blooms. So you end up having, some of us may have heard about, the blob off of the Pacific, of this big wave of warm water and this increase in these harmful algal blooms. And that is something that ends up being more of a problem on that coast. And we have not seen much for viral infections. And we actually do a lot of work out of Alaska as well. And we've been monitoring some colonies out there, but mostly animals that are coming into rehab. And we really see very little for viruses that come through that population. I am a little concerned that as we're seeing the change that is happening with the melting Arctic sea ice, that we will start to see it more, because those channels are opening up for things that are currently in the Atlantic to be able to move around and go over onto that side of the globe. So I don't think they're off the hook just yet, but it has not been a huge problem there to date.
Yeah, that was a really good question. And so I got another one here from Declan, who's 9 years old, and he asks, would harbor seals soon become endangered with the increasing mortality? So I'm not sure who wants to take that one. If maybe Ashley or Kathy.
Well, Mother Nature has a natural way too of keeping things in check. So I could be totally wrong here, but unless something went totally crazy with one of these pathogens, I don't, as much as we talk about the UME that happened most recently in 2018, where the primary pathogen was Phocine distemper virus. 3,000 sounds like a lot, and it is. But when you're talking about, species that are very healthy, the gray seal more so than the harbor seal, I can't imagine it would wipe out an entire species to the point of being endangered. But you never know. I never say never anymore, ever.
So Ashley, if I can just add to that a little bit.
Of course.
I think you're exactly spot on, and I think one of the things that you said is particularly worth repeating, is that for a healthy species. And I think as long as the species is being able to maintain itself at a healthy baseline, and we don't have a bounty on their noses, and we don't have this high level of entanglements and ship strikes, as long as the species is healthy, diseases are going to come through. And for everybody working in the rehab field, it's incredibly painful and heart-wrenching to watch each individual animal that is experiencing this. But we do also have to step back and say diseases are going to come through the population. But if the population is healthy, it can handle it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, because there are so many compounding impacts that can be happening at the same time for these animals. And that's why the Marine Mammal Protection Act is so important to prevent, all of these compounding threats from happening at the same time. And so I got another question here. This one relates to one of Ashley's slides, and it was in Kathy's as well. So in Ashley's slide, it noted that there was an increase in cases from January to March 2019. Since it was not during the pupping season, was there a specific reason for that?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm glad you noticed that. So typically I mentioned that we're usually busiest, keyword being usually, in the summer months, and that corresponds both with harbor seal pupping season, gray seal weanlings, but also the beach season. That's not to say that we don't have years where the winter months end up being really busy or busier than normal. And the reason that you saw those upticks in January through March, and it actually started in December, is those ice seals that we referred to. So we have 2 seal species that come down from the Arctic up in the Canadian provinces, the harp seal and the hooded seal. With the harp seal being more abundant in our area, we don't see as many hooded seals, but we did have a few of them last winter. So again, I never say never. But that's what that uptick was we had a season, and it wasn't just in our response area of New Hampshire and Northern Mass, but throughout our network, which spans from Maine through Virginia for the greater Atlantic, that we were seeing this uptick in harp seals. And most of them actually looked pretty good. And you can imagine an animal that depends on or is reliant on ice and snow caps. These animals, when they get really stressed and they're down here, and we don't necessarily that winter might not have a lot of snow and ice, that they will actually eat to stay hydrated between meals. If they get stressed, similar to how a dog might eat grass, these animals will actually eat sand and rocks, which you can imagine becomes a very large problem for their gastrointestinal system and can be fatal in some animals. So that's something that we keep a close eye on when we have these ice seals on shore and we don't have a lot of the snow and ice in the area, is really keeping people away. They get very stressed out very easily. But luckily in that case, a lot of those animals were pretty healthy and a lot of them didn't need intervention. That's not to say that some of them weren't taken into rehab. I think Mandrake actually in one of Kathy's slides might have been from that year. And he was actually found in a parking lot. So those animals can get kind of wayward as well, and you just never know where you're going to find them. We've had them in people's backyards, in roadways, in parking lots. So they can keep us pretty busy, and they tend to stay out of the water more so than harbor seals and gray seals. They'll stay out for longer periods of time. So yeah, that's a great question for why you noticed that uptick, and I'm glad you did. Not everybody would notice that.
Nice. And so it looks like we're going to go with 2 more questions here just because we're starting to run low on time. But one question for Kathy. So with what Wendy mentioned about the possibility of coronavirus spreading between us and marine mammals, well, for someone who works so closely with the with seals and marine mammals in rehab like you guys do, what steps do you take to prevent the spread between mammals, basically?
Right. So we've been operating all along throughout the pandemic. We have had animals on site the whole time, so we haven't really been able to close. And so, as such, as an essential business, we had to come up with a plan for how we could operate safely. And basically, everything that we are doing to be safe around each other, around our fellow humans, is also appropriate to prevent or reduce the chance of any likelihood of transmitting coronavirus to seals. We have been reducing the number of people on site. We have been socially distancing. We've been wearing our masks and taking all the hygiene protocols. We request that our staff and volunteers stay home if they have a fever, check and monitor their own health, and basically follow all the appropriate CDC and other Massachusetts public health officials' guidances for how to operate safely.
Nice. I think that's definitely a great answer there. And so the last question that we'll end on here, and I think it's a great one to end on, is could each of the 3 speakers advise on how the public can help support their work? So the Seacoast Science Center, National Marine Life Center, and Wendy over at Tufts. If you want to just go in that order.
Sure. I think for me, as far as the response side of things, is just reminding people, and I feel like we do it a lot, but it's just a constant reminder out there, is one, realizing that, especially when it comes to seals, they're only semi-aquatic. So they actually have to come out on land during periods of time, whether it be a pup that mom left it on the beach, or it's in molt and it has to be out of the water, or it's simply just trying to get some rest. They're only semi-aquatic, so it is natural for them to be out there. But that's why we have these trained responders. So if you think that something might be wrong, all too often we encounter people on the beach that think that they're helping. They're very well-intentioned people, and they don't realize that what they might be doing for the animal, whether it's offering it water, or trying to escort it back to the water, trying to put blankets on it if they see that it might be shivering, aren't helpful, and they're very stressful on those animals. It's not natural for them to have people crowding around them or on top of them. So we just ask that people keep a distance away from these animals, not only for the animal safety, but also for the safety of themselves and their pets. These animals are wild animals. Depending on the species, some of them are extremely aggressive. A lot of our species will retreat to the water, but some will actually stand their ground. So it's just dangerous as well. I like to compare it to a raccoon in the woods. Are you going to approach a raccoon if you see it? Probably not. So I always just try to remind people to just keep away from the animal and give us a call. We're more than happy to send a responder out. We'd rather get out there to a healthy animal and be able to talk to the public about why that animal is there, than to not get a call at all and have something might be wrong with that animal. So just keep away and give us a call.
Nice. And what about you, Kathy?
Adding to that, it was some great ways to help. You've learned a lot tonight, and we like speaking with an audience that is so caring about marine animals. I would ask that you share what you learn and tell people why it's important to stay away from seals on the beach. Tell people why it's important to call an authorized member of the stranding network. So share your knowledge, whether it be maybe not face-to-face these days, but over social media or any socially distanced approved mechanism through which you are continuing to reach out to your own network and share your knowledge. Take action, act locally, think globally, and take every step that you can to reduce single-use plastic so that it's not getting into the environment where it can affect us and it can affect the animals. And donate. We're all nonprofits here on this call, and I do want to thank again everybody who donated tonight. We appreciate every dollar matters. Thanks.
Nice. And over to you, Wendy, to finish it off.
What they said. So you can support my work by supporting their work because it is all very intricately connected. And Seacoast Science Center, the National Marine Life Center, Marine Mammals of Maine. There are a number of great organizations that work throughout this region that are doing fantastic work, and they are trying to survive on a shoestring budget. And the more you can help them, the more you can help the bigger picture. And another just very kind of a small concrete thing is, Brian, if you can share afterwards, perhaps in the chat, the link for the Maine website. It's Marine Animal Identification Network. So if you are out on the beach and you see an animal that has a tag, a flipper tag on it, then it's always great if you can report that back, because that means that that animal has had hands on it before, and it is very, very useful information for us to know what happens to it after the fact.
Nice. That's a great point. And I will 100%, everyone who participated in this webinar, you'll be getting a follow-up email with some actions that you can take, and I will absolutely be including that in the actions. I also want to mention, just before we sign off, that another action that you can take, and this is a very pressing issue right now, is that the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument is under threat by the current administration. And I will be sharing a petition with some additional actions you can take to raise your voice, to let our federal government know that we would like to see this area protected. It's the only protected area in New England offshore. It's a couple 100 miles off of Cape Cod, I believe it is, and it protects a deep sea environment that a lot of marine mammals do depend on for food and their well-being. So I just wanted to mention that as well. But and we'll also be hosting this. So this is the second webinar of our 3-part series on marine mammals of New England. So stay tuned for our 3rd episode, which will be about sharks and seals. We'll be talking about great white sharks on Cape Cod. A very interesting topic. So stay tuned. That's going to be our next one coming up in 2 weeks. I just want to say thank you again for everyone who tuned in tonight, took the time, and for everyone who donated. We raised over $310 to support the rescue and rehab work that we do. So big thanks to everyone. Hope you have a great night, and hope you learned something new tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.